Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. So today I'm going to do a video really to cover a lot of common questions I get on the channel here at YouTube. A lot of people ask these questions over and over, and I thought, well, you know, I do handle them in the comments on each video, but it'd be good to start collecting them together in a one big video. I was going to do this out at the sawmill today, but it's really hot and humid out there. I was sweating just standing still out there, and so I moved inside of my workshop. But I'm going to be mixing in some footage from previous videos as I answer some of these questions. And so we can jump right into it. So I think the two most common questions I get on the channel are, what are the dimensions of my sawmill base and what are the dimensions of my sawmill shed? So first I'll start with the base. As you've seen in my videos, I've mounted my sawmill up on a wooden timber base. And when I did that, I was really just trying to mimic the working height of trailer mounted sawmills. Really for the past probably 20 years, I've done a lot of work milling lumber on a Wood-Mizer trailer mounted unit, got very comfortable working at that height. And you know, Woodland Mills sawmills, if you don't do anything special, they're going to be pretty much down on the ground. And so I feel like it's very beneficial to raise them up. And in my case, I wanted to build a really nice, square, straight, true platform that put the mill up at a comfortable working height. And so for my HM122, the sawmill base is 22 inches high, 29 inches wide, and 19.5 feet long. And the height of the saw base, once you put the mill on top of that, puts the sawmill bunks at approximately 29 inches high. And that's a comfortable, you know, thigh to waist high working height when you have the log on the mill. It makes it easy to use the cant hook to move it around and to walk around and make measurements. Also makes it really easy to walk beside the mill as you're cutting. So I'm a big fan of raising up your mill, putting it on a base. Those are the dimensions of my base for the HM122. For other Woodland Mills models, go to their website. They have detailed dimension drawings of their track dimensions with and without the extension, and schematics of the mounting feet, the positioning, all that stuff. And so you can really hone in and get a very accurately sized sawmill base for your mill when you do that. And then the sawmill shed, this was built 8.5 feet wide, 25 feet long. The opening in the front is 8 foot high, and then it has a 312 roof with 16-inch roof overhangs all around. And this was really built as a shed style building with a single sloped roof, pretty much as simple as you can get. And it was sized so that I could have easy access into and out of the sawmill with logs and lumber, you know, bringing logs in, taking lumber back out, and then also to give me very adequate walk around space all around the mill. I put the mill a little bit off center in the building. I want more space up near the head of the mill where I store tools and where I'm starting my cuts. But really, there's a good 2 to 3 feet of walk around space in that building. A lot of the questions I get on the channel about the size of the sawmill shed, they're asked as if there's only one size to build it, and you know that's not the case. You know, build whatever size sawmill shed you want. I just happen to build the one that would fit around the mill, give me walk around space, and be as simple as possible, because you know, I was building that structure pretty much right off the sawmill. I put installed the sawmill and started sawing lumber to build the sawmill shed around it. And that was part of my thinking process is, you know, I'm literally, the mill is right here. I'm building around that mill. What is a smart design for a building that's simple, that I can get up quickly? I really wanted to get a roof over the mill. And so that's what I ended up with. You may have different needs, you know, factor all that in when you're designing and building your sawmill shed. The only recommendation I have good airflow. It's really good to have that sawmill shed open really on the two long sides so you can get good airflow in there. You know, you're working with a gasoline motor, puts out exhaust. You want adequate airflow to get that out. And then the one side of the mill is shooting out copious amounts of sawdust. You really don't want a wall back there because you're just going to be shooting sawdust into a wall. So really the only thing I feel strongly about is having your two long sides of your sawmill shed open for airflow and sawdust management. All right, has the Woodland Mills HM122 met your needs? Will you ever upgrade to a larger Woodland Mills sawmill? So I got that sawmill in 2020. I had been planning for years, to buy a Wood-Mizer. I've been saving up money for it, budgeting for it, thinking about when I would do it. I was going to do it in 2020, and then, COVID hit. And lumber got expensive, and everybody and their brother wanted to buy a sawmill. And suddenly, Wood-Mizer, they had, a 9 to 12 month backlog. I could hardly even get them on the phone to get more information about the mills. I briefly considered Norwood. They do make a good sawmill, but they were clearly struggling with demand during COVID. Just really lousy customer service and support when I tried to talk to them. They also had a backlog. It wasn't as bad as Wood-Mizer. And then I talked to Woodland Mills, and they also had a backlog, but they were very forthcoming with information. They told me, when sawmills were going to become available. I called up and talked to a nice lady on the phone, and she pulled up a spreadsheet, told me inventory numbers, and when this mill's going to be in, when that mill's going to be in. So I like that. I like the fact that they were priced lower than a lot of the other companies. And so at the time, I really, really wanted the HM126, but that was back ordered a couple months, I think, at the time. And so I could get an HM122 with a larger motor within a couple weeks. And just based on my needs and my schedule and what I wanted to do, I went with the HM122. With the larger motor, same motor that 126 would have had. And that sawmill has done really everything I've needed. It's been a great sawmill. It's been a really tremendous value. For the money, it's really hard to beat that sawmill. I think, I forget now, but I think it was in the mid $3,000 range with track extension, shipping, and all that back in 2020. Really, really tremendous value for that sawmill for what it does, especially with the larger motor. That gives you a heck of a lot more power, same power the 126 would have had. So I've been very satisfied with the 122. In retrospect, I didn't really need the 126. I think it would have been nicer because it has a bigger saw head frame, a little bit beefier construction, different height crank. That I like. Has some nicer features, but overall, having lived with the 122 for three years now, it's really done everything I've needed. I've had a couple instances where I tried to put logs, or I wanted to put logs in the mill that were really too big for the mill, and it turns out those logs would have been too big for the 126 as well. I would have barely been able to fit them on the HM130 Max, but that was just one situation. By and large, all the logs I saw are well within the capacity of the HM122 with one track extension that lets me saw up to about 16.5 to 17 foot lumber, and that's really been perfect for me. Now, as far as would I ever upgrade to a larger Woodland Mills sawmill, I like the company, I like their products, but I don't think I would. If I, in the future, move up from the HM122, I will probably go back to Wood-Mizer, just because Woodland Mills, they are targeting kind of a hobby sawmill user, and if you look at the features in the 122 and 126 and 130, there are definite improvements when you go through that range, but really the main difference is sawmill capacity in terms of things like automation, log handling, saw positioning and cutting. Those mills are pretty much all the same. They're manual push mills. You're going to be doing all the log turning and management on the saw bed with cant hooks in your muscles. I don't see a big motivation to move up to those larger mills. Really, the only reason I think someone would consider that is if they need to saw larger lumber and they're okay with the features that Woodland Mills offers. But me personally, myself, and this is nothing against Woodland Mills, you know, if I see the need to move up to larger or better sawmill, I probably will go with Wood-Mizer just to get the advanced features, the deluxe features, really the pro features that they offer, and Woodland Mills doesn't. But, you know, that's a long way off. For now, again, I'm super happy with the 122. It does everything I need, and I love the fact that I continually get my money's worth out of that sawmill. Okay, can you give any general guidelines for milling quality lumber? And that's a big question to answer, so I'm just going to pick out a couple important things. Number one on my list would be to pick good logs, okay? And I have the luxury of having 8 acres of southern yellow pine. I can go pick out the exact tree I want to use for a certain project. There are times when I have to take down trees for other reasons, and I do turn them into lumber, but you know, I have the luxury. If I need to saw a big beam, I go find a big tree, and I can really select the tree I want. I purposely avoid leaning trees because a tree that grows on a lean is going to develop stresses in the wood so that it, you know, is stable while it's growing on a lean. But when you saw into that log, forget it. The lumber is going to go wild and really not be usable. You're going to waste a lot of time. So I avoid leaning trees. I avoid crooked trees that are curved. And I say that, you know, a lot of times I pick what I think is a good tree, and, you know, the bottom log might be perfect, and then I start getting further up the tree and there's a little bit of curvature and twist in it. I generally can work with that, but if a tree is obviously, you know, leaning, crooked, curvy, I avoid those trees. They're really nothing but trouble on the sawmill. Your yield is going to be low. Your lumber quality is going to be low. Some of these curved or leaning trees, I've seen it where as you're sawing, you know, you're sawing off a slab or a board, before you even get to the end of your cut, that board is curved off and doing its own thing. I mean, it's like turning into a hockey stick in real time. And if it doesn't do it then, during or after it seasons and dries, it's gonna twist and curve. So pick good trees, avoid the obvious bad trees. That's probably my biggest piece of advice. When you're milling on the mill, when you get your log on the mill, take a minute to study that log, look at the ends, measure the ends, get an idea if the log is tapered. Is one end bigger than the other? If so, you're going to want to use a toe board to level out the center of that log. Decide which side of the log should be on the mill first. You might want to rotate it to make your first cut. So, you know, take the time to study the log, understand the grain, the rings, the structure, the shape, and the taper before you even make your first cut, before you even really get it to the mill. And then as you're making your squaring cuts to square up your cant, you know, I've seen quite often on YouTube, people will make a cut, rotate 90 degrees, make a cut 90 degrees. And that's really not a good way to do things. What you want to do, you make your first cut, you want to then do a 180 degree rotation, get that log now down on the flat that you just made so that you have a nice true reference working surface. Make your second cut, now you've got two parallel surfaces, then you will rotate 90, make your third cut, rotate 180, make your fourth cut. Always take advantage of the square, true, flat surface you just cut into that cant to get that side down on your mill bed or up against your stops, or both if you can, and you know, let gravity help hold that in position while you make your follow-on cuts. And so, you know, if you see my videos, you know, I go through that procedure. First cut, rotate 180, second cut, and so on. It takes, you know, extra rotations, but, you know, I can tell you right now, it results in better quality lumber, truer lumber, squarer cants, square lumber in the end. So, you know, rotate it to your flat side down as soon as possible. And, you know, in conjunction with that is the use of the toe board. And I kind of hinted that, you know, if the log is tapered, you want to measure the big and the small ends, and then use a toe board to level up the center of that log, so that when you're making your squaring cuts in your cant, you're keeping that grain centered. You're not sawing the log you know, lopsided, which wastes lumber, really hurts quality. And so, you know, if the log is tapered, for me, you know, I'm typically sawing 12-foot or 16-foot logs. If there's more than 1 inch of taper from end to end, I will use the toe board. It makes that much of a difference. So those are just some general guidelines for milling quality lumber. And you know, I'm mixing in B-roll footage from some of my past videos. I have a video on the use of a toe board. Encourage you to check that out if you're interested. I use a very inexpensive motorcycle jack from Amazon to act as my toe board. It does everything I need. So check out that video if you're interested in the use of the toe board. Okay, so have you tried wider and thicker blades? No, and I've done a video about that. I often see people touting the benefit of going to a wider or thicker blade, or wider and thicker blade on their woodland mill sawmill. But anybody who recommends that is lacking a fundamental understanding of how blades are supposed to work and how they're supposed to be stretched, okay? When you tension a blade, think about that blade as a big spring. When you're tensioning it up, you're actually tensioning it indirectly to a certain level of tensile stress in the metal of that blade. And that's important to keep the blade springy, to keep it tight, to let it soak up vibrations and shocks and imperfections in the wood when you hit knots and anything like that. You want some springiness in the blade. And that's what the blade tension gives you. The tensile stress is really a function of how tightly you're going to stretch that blade with your tensioning mechanism, and then the cross-sectional area of the metal in that blade, okay? If you go to a thicker blade, a wider blade, or a blade that's wider and thicker, then you need to have more tension in the tensioning mechanism on your sawmill to crank that blade up to this appropriate level of tensile stress, because now it's got a bigger cross-section of metal in the blade. And the woodland mill's tensioning mechanism really doesn't have that capability in it, okay? And so what I've seen several times on YouTube, someone's going to put a wider, thicker blade in their sawmill. They crank it up to where they had it before with their normal blade, and without realizing it, they're running that blade slack. It's not stretched enough. It doesn't have enough tensile stress. And what that means is that any potential gains or benefits they would have gotten from the wider, thicker blade, which is primarily going to be stiffness, they've just pretty much thrown that away. So at best, it's going to be a wash. In some ways, it could be worse. And so I did a video on this topic, I don't know, probably a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. Check that out if you're interested. No, I have not run wider or thicker blades in my sawmill. I've never seen the need personally. And then I know mechanically, the tensioner mechanism is not capable of stretching those blades up to where they would be. So check out that video if you're interested. I get a lot of people writing with questions about can I help them because they keep throwing blades, the blades are jumping off, or their belts are smoking, or all kinds of crazy issues. And I think early on, within a couple months of owning the sawmill, so probably back in 2021, I did a video about how to prevent your blade from jumping off. So I'm 3 years into owning this sawmill now, over 100 hours of operation, a lot of videos, so you can see all the lumber I've produced. I have never had a blade come off of that mill, ever. And, you know, knock on wood, it has been perfectly reliable in that regard. I've never had issues with the belt. I've never had any really tracking issues. Part of one of the things I recommended in that earlier video was to, you know, before you saw any lumber, spin everything by hand, look at the blade, you know, make sure it's not moving, make sure it stays where you set it at when you tensioned up your wheels. And you know, take the time to track that blade, and you really should avoid all kinds of problems. I've only had to retrack my mill twice in 3 years. In fact, one time I did it was just a couple weeks ago. It was the first time I'd sawn in a few months. You know, I don't generally saw a lot in the summer, and so this was probably the first time I'd sawn since winter. Put a new blade on, tensioned it up, checked everything, spun it by hand, and the blade wanted to keep walking back. And so, you know, quickly within seconds, I grabbed a wrench, went to the tracking adjustment on the sawmill, made a very small tweak, tensioned everything back up, checked it, and the blade was staying put and working great. And you know, then I started the motor, throttled up the mill, watched the blade, everything was happy. At the end of the day, I checked the blade, it was in the same position on both wheels where I left it. And so the mill's been very reliable for me as far as not throwing any blades and tracking being consistent. But I have periodically checked and retracked it as needed. And in, you know, one of the earlier videos I did, I think I said a common cause I saw on the Woodland Mills Facebook group when people throwing blades is they had their lubrication turned all the way up, and water was just shooting out. And you know, that water gets between the blade and your drive wheel or your follower wheels, and that blade is under tension. You know, of course, it's going to want to squirt right off of the wheels, and it's gonna soak your belts. And so, you know, don't use too much lubrication, and do your pre-flight check. Make sure everything is true when you spin it up by hand. If anything is not right, that's the time to correct it. Don't be impatient. You know, don't throw a log on there, throttle up, and then throw a blade, because then that can become catastrophic. You can damage your mill. You'll definitely ruin your blade. You could ruin a nice piece of wood. So take your time. Don't be impatient. Check all that stuff ahead of time. Check your belt tension. Adjust that if you need to. Check your guides. Check all of those things before you get milling. And you know, I think if you do, your mill's going to be very reliable, like mine has. Okay, so another good question is, do you have any issues sawing into the log stops? And this is another common thing I used to see all the time on the Woodland Mills Facebook group, which I don't follow anymore because it got frustrating to see people making the same mistakes over and over again and asking the same questions. But a lot of folks on that group were sawing into their log stops, and you had people saying, well, you should take out the metal ones and replace them with oak ones, so if you saw into them, there's no damage. And I'm like, well, that's a good solution, but the problem is that you're sawing into the log stops in the first place, and that should never happen. That really means you're not paying attention to your mill and your log and your blade. And you know, this is I think it's kind of humorous when you saw into a log stop, but there can be a safety issue. Things can go really wrong, besides just ruining the blade and putting a nice saw groove in your log stop. The act of doing this puts you at risk for more catastrophic failures and injury. Okay, so to me, this is like one of the easiest things you can avoid when you're operating any type of saw, whether it's a hand saw or a sawmill. You know, pay attention to what your blade is doing. Clear any things out of the area that are metal and not meant to be cut. you know, that's true whether you're using a handsaw or a sawmill, but especially in a sawmill where the entire saw bed is, you know, big metal frame, and you've got these posts rigidly mounted that are metal, and you've got guides and other things that are metal. You know, be aware that, you know, as you're sawing, you really only want that bandsaw cutting wood, okay? The wood you intend to cut, not the mill, not the frame, not anything else. And so I think the number one thing to do to avoid cutting your log stops is just pay attention. Pay attention before the cut, check everything, look it over. Pay attention after the cut, pay attention during the cut. And another thing I've been asked in a lot of my videos is, what do you keep looking at when you're walking down, pushing the mill alongside a log? Well, I'm looking at the blade, I'm looking at the stops, I'm looking at the clamps. Those are all things you could hit with the blade. Those are all things that need to be under the blade. Those are all things that could jiggle loose and cause vibration or motion of your wood, and, you know, cause everything to just catastrophically fail. So there's a lot to pay attention to when you're milling. The least of which is are your log stops. And so, you know, just know I haven't ever cut any log stops because I'm paying attention to things. I've come close a couple times when I wasn't as religious about paying attention as I should be. And what saved me was the blade guard on the sawmill, which is just a little, you know, piece of metal rod that's hooked that you can angle down in front of the blade. That saved me 2 or 3 times. And, you know, if you have that on your mill, keep it on the mill and adjust it. And that's the backup, you know, for any inattention or unplanned changes. That is going to save your blade. It's going to prevent you from going into the log stops. Now, I have heard people say, well, it always gets in the way when I do a blade change, or sometimes it hits a limb or a knot on the log. Okay, well, first of all, it's just got a little Allen screw, a little set screw you can use to quickly flip it up out of the way for a blade change, or flip it up out of the way if there's a knot or a piece of a limb sticking out of your log. So, you know, you can temporarily flip that blade guard out of the way pretty quickly. More importantly, though, you know, don't put logs on your mill that have limbs and knobs and knots sticking out. They can create other problems that are way worse than bumping into it with the blade guard. You really want to clean your logs off, trim that stuff off. If there's any weird high spots, you know, trim them off with a chainsaw before you put them on the mill. But pay attention, use that blade guard, and, you know, hopefully you'll be like me and not run into any of the log stops. Knock on wood again. Okay, so the next one. Okay, do you have any feedback on the digital readout you installed on the sawmill? And yeah, that was a video I did probably 6-7 months ago. Put a DRO, a DRO, on the sawmill, and it's really just a digital readout of the position, the height of the saw blade above the bed. And I used that a bit at first, and I kind of forced myself to use it because I've been milling for 20-ish years. I'm very accustomed to using the rulers, so I had to kind of force myself to use the DRO. And what I found is that it slowed me down. I just didn't like it. It worked perfectly. It wasn't expensive. I think it was $60 or so on eBay. Never gave me any problems. Always stayed accurate. I never had to recalibrate it or anything. But it was just slower than using a ruler, and it got to be annoying after a while. And I'll give you an example of how it's slower. Okay, for absolute cuts, you're just reading your height off of the mill bed. It was fine for that stuff. Where it got to slow me down was for making incremental cuts. So say you've got a cant squared up and you want to just go through and slice off some boards or some 2x or whatever. With a DRO, that process involves going to a starting position, then going to an incremental measurement where you just display, let's say if you're cutting a 1-inch board or 2x, let's say 2x4 or something, you'll crank the mill down until that incremental display shows 1.5 inches. Or, you know, in my case, I like to oversaw 2x, so I go to 1 5/8. So when it dries, it's 1.5. Make the cut, reset that back to 0, increment another, you know, 1.5 or 1 5/8, make the cut, and so on. There's a lot of button pushing and extra steps in that process. And my normal process with the ruler is, you know, at my starting cut, I line up a ruler that has the pre-marked increments I want to cut on. I line up one of those marks where the blade is, and then make the cut, crank it down to the next mark, make the cut, crank it down to the next part. I don't have to read numbers. I don't have to reset anything. I don't even have to think. I'm just moving a pointer to a mark over and over. And so it ended up being quicker for me and more productive. And so, you know, the DRO did work. It worked as intended. But on a manual mill where you're cranking, it just, to me, wasn't as quick as aiming a pointer at marks on a scale. So I've gone back to my scale, and I've got the DRO. It's over there. In fact, you know, I might pull it out for a certain project, but for general use, I'm happier with the rulers myself. All right, along those same lines, have you ever seen the need to install a laser on the sawmill? And that's a good one. I've seen that done on some other channels. And my reaction to that one is, well, what matters to me when lining up my cuts is what the inside of the log looks like, okay? The rings, the grain, the taper, the alignment. The laser is not going to show me the inside of the log. It's not going to tell me if the log is tapered and I need to use a toe board to center up the grain and the rings. The laser really doesn't help me. What the laser shows you, you know, if you've gone through the process of studying the log, measuring both ends, adjusting your toe board to level it, it shows you where your blade is going to cut after you've worked out all the hard stuff, right? After you've done your homework. But I don't really care about that. What I care about is understanding the log, making my measurements, understanding the grain and the rigs, leveling it with the toe board, using the dimensions of the center of the log off of the bed on the small end of the log to numerically set the height of my blade, and then making my cut to square up the cant. At that point, I don't really care where the blade is. I know where the blade is supposed to be because I figured it out the smart way. And so a laser in that scenario is just going to show me where my blade is cutting, which I already know because I specified that based on, you know, more advanced reasoning to get a higher quality cut, more yield out of that log, to take advantage of the grain structure in that log. And so I have not seen the need for a laser myself. I've seen other folks use it, and when I see them use it, it's obvious to me they're sawing visually, but they're not measuring the ends of the log, they're not looking at the grain, they're not leveling their logs. They're really just using it to make sure when they put their blade in the wood that it cuts all the way through and leaves a flat spot. And that's really not the way to do it if you want to maximize yield and lumber quality. Those other things are the way to do it, okay? There is one scenario where I think the laser would be useful, and if you see a lot of my videos, after I've squared up a cant and cut the lumber, I will go back and pick up some of the cutoffs and make a bonus piece of lumber out of them, like a, you know, 2x4 or 2x6, a smaller piece of lumber that I can get out of those cutoffs. And in those situations, I'm often flipping up the cutoff and putting it on edge, and then trying to figure out where the wavy bark line is and just cut below that to get rid of all the bark and leave a nice clean piece of lumber. That scenario, the laser would be very useful. And then also when I cut stickers, I'm often taking remnants, what's left over after cutting the lumber from a log, putting that up on edge, trimming off the bark, and cutting strips. The laser would be useful for that as well. So those are two scenarios where the lasers be useful, but you know, those are in the grand scheme of things, when I'm milling lumber in a kind of a production mode, going for quality and yield, those two tasks are kind of what happens after I'm done and I've got leftovers that I can take advantage of. And so the laser would help with that, but it's really not going to impact my main production sawing. And I don't think it's going to help me cut better quality lumber, because like I said, I'm not cutting visually based upon what happens along the length of the log. I'm looking at the ends of the log and the grain and making a tape measure gauge of both ends of the log, leveling, positioning log with a toe board. That's what tells me where my blade height has to be, and that's all dependent on what's inside the log, not where the blade cuts on the outside of the log. That ends up being a result of everything, not what I set things by or what's important. So no laser for me. All right, here's a comment question. What are you doing with that jack thing on the sawmill? That's the toe board. I've covered that in a few of the previous questions. Again, I'm just using a pretty low cost motorcycle jack I got on Amazon. I'll put a link below. I think it was 80 bucks. It's taken a lot of abuse. That particular motorcycle jack, I think, has a 1,200 pound capacity. I am sure I've exceeded that with some of the big logs I put on the mill. But it's taken the abuse. It's done fine. And so that jack is basically a poor man's toe board. If you go to a nicer, more advanced mill like a Wood-Mizer, it'll have a little actuated toe board. You can position it and raise it and all kinds of cool things. This one is just a motorcycle jack that does the same thing in the end, but I have to position it. Sometimes I move it from one end of the mill to the other. But it's very handy. It definitely improves your yield and your quality of lumber, because again, it's letting you center up the grain in that log to make really good, precise scoring cuts. Okay, so now we're at the last question. I think I moved this one to the last because I probably will rattle on about this. And I get this question both from viewers and from companies. Do you take sponsors or freebies on your channel? And the answer is no. I've been approached a few times by companies who want me to showcase their product on the channel. They've offered to send me some product or equipment to use on the channel, and I'm definitely curious to do that. I think it would be fun. I mean, who wouldn't like to get to try out a new piece of equipment for free at no cost? But something about that whole thing bothers me. It bothers me in a couple ways. First of all, I've seen this happen on other channels, and it just always crosses the line to me. It strikes me as a little bit wrong. You know, I don't fault the channel owners for doing that. And some of these other channels, they produce great content. I watch it myself. I enjoy their content. I just cringe a little bit when I see them promoting a product or even using a product that they did not have to pay for. It just kind of strikes me as a little bit wrong, a little bit. I don't know if I want to use the word unethical, but it's just not right to me. So I've just avoided that whole situation on my channel. And really the main reason, I feel like I offer more credibility when I can show you equipment and products that I paid money for. And you know, like I've said many wonderful things about the Woodland Mill sawmill, their stump grinder, my Kubota tractor. That has all been wonderful equipment, but I feel like I can say that to you very genuinely and honestly because I spent my hard-earned money on that equipment. I mean, when I say that Woodland Mills HM122 is a tremendous value and I really got my money's worth out of it, you know, I'm saying I got my money's worth out of it. And so that's a very honest assessment. And I don't feel like I could be that honest or fair if someone loaned me or gave me a piece of equipment. So I've really avoided that. I'm also conscious that some of my sawmill review videos, particularly for the Woodland Mills, HM122, that's gotten, hundreds of thousands of views. People really tend to appreciate that video and some of the similar follow-on videos when I review that product. And I just feel better knowing that everything in those reviews is my genuine, honest opinion. I work a full-time job and I have 2 part-time jobs I use to support my family and to buy all these nice things like sawmills and tractors. And I just feel like it carries a heck of a lot more weight and honesty, and it's just more genuine if you know that it's my hard-earned money that goes into buying those products, and I show them on my channel because I'm genuinely satisfied with them and they work out great for me. I don't think I've ever said anything bad about a product that I've bought. I generally don't keep products like that around. I mean, if something is not working or it's not a good product, I'll return it or get rid of it and move on. So everything I show on the channel, it's equipment I've paid for. I generally find it to be productive and really helpful, and you're getting my honest opinion. So no, thus far I have not taken any sponsors or freebies. About the worst thing I think I do is I got hats that say Stihl and Kubota and Woodland Mills, and I'm a sucker for a free hat. I'll even pay for a hat. I mean, I'm a sucker for a good hat. So that's about the worst promotion you're going to find on this channel right now. If anybody has any opinions on this, by the way, please let me know. I know there are other sawing channels that get products and promote them. I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on that. I'd also be curious to hear feedback on all the questions I answered here today. There's about a dozen or so questions, and I'll break them up in the video so people can go straight to the one of interest. If you have questions that I should address in another video on Q&A or anything else, let me know. Please leave them in the comments down below, and we can do this again with another round of questions. But until then, thanks for watching.